Imagine waking up feeling genuinely rested, full of energy that lasts all day, without needing constant snacks or caffeine jolts. Picture that stubborn weight, especially around the middle, finally starting to shift. Not because you're starving, but because your body is working with you. And what if you could have crystal clear focus and a steady mood, free from those blood sugar crashes that leave you irritable? This isn't really about calorie counting or endless cardio. It's about understanding the master switch that controls all of this. One crucial hormone. And here's the surprising part. Most people have way too much of it without even realizing the impact. Welcome to the deep dive. We've taken a stack of your notes and research on this critical topic, and our mission today is to, cut through the noise. We're going to extract the most important knowledge, the absolute must-know nuggets, to help you understand this powerful hormone, identify what's triggering its excess in your life, and explore a remarkably simple yet incredibly effective approach to bringing it back into balance, using straightforward dietary and timing strategies. Let's really dig in.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This hormone, insulin, it's central to so much more than just blood sugar. We tend to think of it only, in the context of diabetes, but its influence reaches into energy levels, weight, mood, even cognitive function. It's essential, of course. Its job is to help move glucose, the sugar from our food, out of the bloodstream and into our cells for energy or storage. But as the sources you've provided detail, the problems, the real cascade, begins when insulin levels are consistently too high for too long.
And the mechanism the sources describe for why high insulin is a problem is quite revealing. It's like the cells, the receptors.
Yeah.
They just get overwhelmed.
Exactly. Overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the hormone constantly knocking.
So they start ignoring it. The sources use pretty strong language here, saying these receptors downgrade, become resistive, and blocked.
That's precisely it. That state is what we call insulin resistance. The cells are resisting the signal from insulin. The receptors aren't functioning effectively anymore. Think of it like having a key that should open a lock, but the lock is gummed up. It just won't turn. Even with the right key, the door stays shut.
And the body's response to this, this ineffective signal, that's where things really go sideways, right?
Right.
Because the pancreas senses the blood sugar isn't going into the cells properly.
Right.
So it thinks, we just need more insulin. It ramps up production.
Exactly. It's a really problematic feedback loop. The pancreas works harder and harder, pumping out more and more insulin to try and overcome that resistance at the cell level. So you end up with this paradoxical situation, very high levels of insulin circulating in the blood. The insulin itself isn't effectively doing its primary job of getting glucose into the cells. This state of hyperinsulinemia, or just too much insulin, coupled with insulin resistance, is, according to these sources, a fundamental, often missed underlying cause for a huge array of metabolic issues.
Okay, so if high ineffective insulin is the root problem, what are the things in our modern lives, our diets, that are flipping that switch? What's constantly telling our pancreas to pump out more? The sources you shared lay out a surprisingly long list, 13 key factors. This is where it gets really interesting for understanding what might be going on in your body.
Indeed, and many of these are much more common than people realize. The first two are maybe the most obvious, directly related to diet. The sources point straight to sugar in all its forms.
All forms?
Yes, they're very clear. Dextrose, high fructose corn syrup, plain table sugar, brown sugar, raw sugar, even honey, all flagged as significant triggers for insulin release.
So no loophole for natural sugars like honey or the less refined ones. When it comes to spiking insulin, the sources say sugar is just sugar.
That seems to be the takeaway, yes. Anything that rapidly converts to glucose in the bloodstream is going to provoke a strong insulin response. And that leads directly to the second trigger, refined grains.
Yes. Breads, pasta.
Exactly. The sources list the common culprits: breads, pasta, breakfast cereals, crackers, biscuits. These are carbs that have been processed, stripped of fiber and nutrients, making them very quickly digestible. Like pure sugar, they hit your bloodstream fast, demanding a large insulin response.
Okay, so the main culprits are those fast-absorbing carbs, sugars, and processed starches. But it's not just what you eat, is it? The sources also highlight how often you eat.
That's the third critical trigger. The frequency of eating. This is a direct trigger. Every single time you put food in your mouth, you initiate a process that involves releasing insulin. It might be a small amount depending on the food, but it happens.
So the standard 3 meals plus snacks.
Yeah, if you're eating 3 meals a day plus snacks in between, as is often recommended, you are spiking your insulin multiple times throughout the day. The sources note that eating less frequently is the basic idea behind intermittent fasting, which we'll definitely get into as part of the solution. Constant eating means constant insulin demands.
That makes a lot of sense, just giving the system a break. Now, something a bit surprising from the sources was about protein. We usually think protein is pretty low insulin, but they differentiate based on the type.
Yes, this is point number 4, protein type. They reference something called the insulin scale. And counter to a lot of the common low-fat advice, the sources indicate that lean protein actually triggers insulin more than protein that includes its natural fat.
Really, more.
That's what they state. The recommendation is to avoid focusing only on lean, low-fat protein and instead include the whole food, fat included, as nature has provided, is the phrasing used.
So choosing, say, chicken thighs with the skin instead of just a plain breast, or fattier cuts of meat, that might actually be better for managing insulin, according to this.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. The presence of fat alongside the protein seems to modulate or lessen the insulin response compared to a protein source stripped of its fat.
Interesting. And related to that, point number 5 is simply eating excessive protein overall, too much at once.
Right. Even if it's the right type, just consuming a very large quantity of protein at one time can also trigger a significant insulin release. The sources suggest aiming for an optimum amount, generally cited as being between 3 and 6 ounces per meal.
Ounces of the actual food, right? Not protein grams. We'll come back to that.
Correct, the weight of the food. They do acknowledge that larger individuals or those eating less frequently, doing IF, might have slightly more in one sitting, but the caution is against consistently going too much with protein quantity. Find the right amount that fuels you without overstimulating insulin.
Okay, so quality and quantity matter for protein too. Got it. Beyond sugar, refined grains, frequency, and protein. What else is on this trigger list?
Point number 6 identifies certain oils. Specifically called out are soy oil and corn oil, among others.
The industrial seed oils.
Yes, often highly processed, frequently from genetically modified sources, like soy sprayed with glyphosate. The sources link these oils directly to triggering insulin resistance and spiking insulin levels.
So steering clear of those, which are in so many processed foods, is pretty key then.
Absolutely. And closely related, point number 7 is trans fats, those artificially created hydrogenated oils. These are explicitly linked in the sources to causing insulin resistance and increasing insulin.
Okay.
The strong recommendation is avoid all hydrogenated oils. They're just detrimental on multiple levels, including this insulin effect.
Okay, we've covered quite a few dietary elements. What about things like hormones or other physiological factors?
Right. That brings us to number 8, cortisol and steroids. Cortisol is our body's main stress hormone. High levels of cortisol, whether from chronic stress or from synthetic versions like prednisone, steroid shots, creams used for inflammation, these are shown in the sources to contribute to insulin resistance.
Wow, so stress alone can be a significant factor in this whole insulin picture. That's huge for so many people.
It really is. It just shows how deeply interconnected everything is. And then the sources get into some quite surprising medication-related triggers. This is eye-opening. Number 9 is diuretics, commonly prescribed for high blood pressure, right, to remove excess fluid.
Yeah.
The sources highlight a stated side effect. They can cause insulin resistance.
Cause it.
Yes, which in turn increases insulin levels. And what does high insulin contribute to? It can cause increased sodium retention, which then contributes to higher blood pressure. The sources call this cycle crazy and, well, it's hard to argue. A medication for high blood pressure potentially making the underlying driver worse via insulin.
Wow. That does sound like a frustrating loop. And you mentioned something similar with statins for cholesterol.
Yes, number 10 is statins, those widely prescribed cholesterol-lowering meds. According to the sources, statins can also cause insulin resistance. Insulin then increases, and high insulin is known to increase cholesterol production by the liver. So again, the sources point to this potentially crazy cycle where the treatment for one issue, high cholesterol, might worsen another fundamental metabolic issue, insulin resistance, which could actually be contributing to the cholesterol problem in the first place.
That really underscores the importance of looking at root causes, doesn't it? So diet, frequency, stress hormones, even common medications. What's next on the list?
Number 11 is MSG, or monosodium glutamate. You might see it on labels as modified food starch sometimes, though that term can be a bit ambiguous. The sources note MSG is prevalent in many processed foods, fast food, restaurant meals. They offer a practical tip. If food tastes maybe a bit too good, suspect MSG.
And it spikes insulin.
It can directly increase insulin, yes. And they describe that very common effect many people have experienced, feeling absolutely starving an hour or so after eating food with MSG, like maybe at some Chinese restaurants.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Right. It happens because the MSG causes an insulin spike, which then drops blood sugar quickly, leading to reactive hypoglycemia and intense hunger again, not sustained satisfaction.
That rapid return of hunger is such a clear signal. Okay, beyond these specific food and medication triggers, the sources also point to our underlying nutritional status. Deficiencies.
Yes. Number 12 covers mineral deficiencies. The sources link deficiencies in specific minerals to an increased risk of insulin resistance or higher insulin levels. Key ones mentioned are potassium deficiency and magnesium deficiency. These are just crucial for countless cellular processes, including those related to insulin signaling and glucose use.
Potassium and magnesium. They seem to come up in almost every discussion about fundamental health.
They absolutely do. And here's another one the sources highlight as maybe counterintuitive. Low sodium or following a low-salt diet. They note that restricting sodium intake can actually increase the risk of insulin resistance.
You freeze it. But doctors often say low salt for blood pressure.
Exactly. The irony, as pointed out again using that crazy framing, is that doctors often recommend low salt. But if that increases insulin resistance, the resulting higher insulin can cause the body to retain sodium and fluid, potentially worsening blood pressure anyway.
So focusing on the symptom might miss the underlying insulin issue.
It suggests that possibility, yes. It highlights how focusing just on symptoms can sometimes be problematic if insulin is the driver.
Okay, so maybe conventional wisdom on salt needs rethinking if insulin resistance is involved. What other minerals were mentioned?
Zinc deficiency is strongly linked in the sources. Zinc is essential for making insulin itself, and it's crucial for supporting the beta cells in the pancreas. Those are the cells that produce insulin. The sources emphasize that the beta cells absorb more zinc than any other cells in the body. That really highlights its importance.
Right.
They explicitly state that low zinc can set you up for diabetes, using their phrasing, meaning it impairs the very system that regulates blood sugar.
So zinc is fundamental to the whole insulin system functioning correctly.
Exactly. Low chromium is also mentioned as a mineral deficiency that can contribute to insulin resistance.
And finally, point 13 covers vitamin deficiencies or excess.
Yes, a bit of both. The sources note that having high levels of calcium can actually cause insulin resistance.
High calcium, all right?
And then deficiencies in several vitamins are listed: low B1, thiamine, low vitamin D, and low vitamin A. Each of these plays a role in different metabolic pathways that can influence insulin sensitivity and how we handle glucose.
That's 13 distinct factors. It's a remarkably comprehensive list. From the obvious sugars and refined grains to less expected things like certain oils, stress, medications, MSG, and even micronutrient status. It really paints a picture of how many things in our modern lives can push us towards this underlying issue of excessive, ineffective insulin, often without us even connecting the dots.
It truly is a web of interconnected factors. And as the sources suggest, given how common these triggers are in the standard modern diet and lifestyle, it's highly probable that the vast majority of the population is dealing with elevated insulin or insulin resistance to some degree, even if they haven't been diagnosed with, say, type 2 diabetes.
Okay, understanding those triggers is absolutely step one. It highlights what the problem is and why it might exist for so many of us. That can feel a bit daunting. What's the good news? What's step two?
The sources you provided seem to converge on a powerful two-pronged approach to address this. Healthy ketosis combined with intermittent fasting.
Right. This is where you actively start working with your body's metabolic design, essentially, to lower that excessive insulin and shift its primary fuel source.
Let's unpack that. First, what exactly is ketosis in this context?
So at its core, ketosis is a natural metabolic state. It's where your body transitions from relying primarily on glucose or sugar for fuel to burning fat instead. As your body breaks down stored fat for energy, it produces these molecules called ketones as a byproduct.
And these ketones can then be used by most of your cells, including your brain cells, as an alternative and actually very efficient fuel source.
And the sources seem quite enthusiastic about ketones as fuel, using some great analogies, right?
They do. They describe ketones as a much, much better fuel source than sugar. Comparisons like switching from a dirty, inefficient engine to a clean, highly effective one. Ketones are called cleaner fuel, more efficient, less dirty, producing no waste, and running quietly. The idea is that running on fat and ketones provides a smoother, more stable energy supply compared to the ups and downs you get from burning glucose.
That cleaner fuel idea is very compelling. What are the specific benefits the sources list for being in this fat-burning, ketone-producing state?
Well, beyond the cleaner fuel aspect, they highlight several key benefits. One major one is much more stable blood sugars. Without the constant influx of dietary sugar or fast carbs, it leads to feeling more level-headed, more stable throughout the day. Your brain function gets a significant boost. The sources say the brain loves it, leading to sharper memory, better focus. And crucially, being in ketosis also helps protect protein and muscle mass. When your body is efficiently burning fat, it's not forced to break down its own lean tissue for energy, which can happen when blood sugar drops low and fat isn't readily usable. They also mention potential improvements in ligaments, tendons, and collagen.
Those are pretty significant benefits. Stable energy, better brain function, preserving muscle. So how do you actually get into this state? How do you trigger ketosis?
The fundamental trigger, according to the sources, is basically depleting your body's readily available glucose stores. This typically happens when you avoid consuming glucose or sugar for a period of time. Generally, around 10 to 12 hours is enough to start the process. When glucose isn't coming in, your body naturally turns to its fat reserves.
Okay, so a period without carbs or sugar is the signal. But it's not like flipping a switch instantly, right? The sources mention the body needs time to adapt.
That's a critical point, and one where patience is really necessary. The transition from being primarily a sugar burner to an efficient fat burner takes time. Your cells need to literally build new machinery, that's the phrase used, new metabolic pathways, enzymes, even more mitochondria, to effectively process and use fat and ketones for energy.
So it's a real physical change at the cellular level.
Yes, and this adaptation period can vary quite a bit. Could be as little as 3 days for some, maybe up to 2 weeks for others. And in some cases, especially if someone's been a long-time high-carb eater, it might take up to 6 weeks to become fully fat-adapted.
So you might feel a bit off. Maybe you have that keto flu people talk about during that transition while your body builds that new machinery.
That's certainly possible, yes. The sources imply that's part of the process as your body is shifting gears, fuel-wise, and building the necessary infrastructure.
Is there a way to, check if you're actually producing ketones and getting into that state?
Yes, the sources mention using ketone strips. These are usually urine strips you can find easily. You just test your urine. And different shades of purple on the strip give you an indication of the level of ketones present. It confirms your body is indeed breaking down fat.
Okay. And they make a distinction between just ketosis and something they call healthy keto. What's the difference there?
Healthy keto, as presented in these sources, isn't just about getting into ketosis by any means necessary, like, say, just eating sticks of butter. It places a strong emphasis on nutrient density and the quality of the food you eat while keeping carbs low and fat high. The underlying principle they stress is really transformative. You don't lose weight and get healthy, but rather you have to get healthy first to then lose weight.
Get healthy first.
Yes. So the focus is on providing your body with all the necessary vitamins, minerals, essential fats from high-quality foods while restricting carbs. This sets the stage for metabolic healing, which then enables sustainable fat loss.
That really flips the script compared to just focusing on calorie restriction.
Okay, so that's healthy ketosis fat burning with high-quality food. What about the second part of the solution, intermittent fasting, IF?
Right. Intermittent fasting, or IF, isn't a diet in terms of what foods you eat. It's defined in the sources as a pattern of eating and not eating. Essentially, it just means eating less frequently.
And we touched on frequency being a direct trigger for insulin. So IF directly tackles that specific trigger.
Absolutely. That's the core mechanism. Every time you eat, you stimulate insulin release. By reducing the number of times you eat throughout the day, you dramatically reduce the number of insulin spikes. The goal isn't zero insulin, you need it when you eat, but to eliminate the excessive, constant insulin stimulation that drives resistance. The sources reiterate that the vast majority of people likely have this issue, often undiagnosed because standard tests look at blood sugar, not fasting insulin. AF provides those crucial periods where insulin levels can drop significantly, allowing the receptors to hopefully regain sensitivity. It's like giving your whole insulin system a much-needed rest and a chance to reset. How do you actually start doing intermittent fasting? What's the practical advice?
The simplest starting point the sources suggest is just go as long as you can in the morning without eating. Listen to your body. Eat when you genuinely feel hungry, not just out of habit or because the clock says so. They also point out that what you ate for your last meal the night before will significantly impact how hungry you feel the next morning.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The goal, as you get more adapted, is to actually wake up not feeling hungry.
That really contrasts with the old idea that you must eat breakfast right away to stoke the furnace or whatever.
It does challenge that conventional wisdom, and once you're comfortable pushing back that first meal, the sources recommend progressing. The common pattern they suggest moving towards is shifting from the typical 3 meals a day with absolutely no snacking in between.
No snacks is key.
Crucial. Moving from 3 meals to 2 meals a day, again, with no snacks.
2 meals a day. What does that usually look like in terms of timing? How long is the eating window?
For many people, adopting that 2-meal structure means condensing their eating into a relatively short window. The sources often describe this as an eating window of about 4 hours. So you eat your first meal, maybe wait around 4 hours, eat your second meal, and then you're done eating for the day.
4-hour window.
Yeah, and this naturally creates a really significant fasting period, roughly 20 hours, between your last meal one day and your first meal the next. The sources describe this 20-hour fasting window as incredible and enough to see some serious results for most people dealing with insulin issues.
20 hours fasted. That's a big chunk of the day. Are there variations mentioned? What if someone has a really slow metabolism or isn't seeing results with 2 meals?
Yes, the sources do acknowledge that. For individuals with particularly stubborn or slow metabolisms, they mention examples like those going through menopause, dealing with slow thyroid function, or maybe someone with a long history of restrictive dieting that has kind of damaged their metabolism. Metabolism dead is the phrase used.
Right.
For them, even 2 meals might result in very slow weight loss. In these specific, more challenging cases, consolidating further to 1 meal a day might be necessary. And in extremely rare situations, they even mention eating every other day as a potential strategy. But they emphasize this is for severe cases, really, until the system starts to heal and respond better. The general approach is start with 2 meals, adjust only if truly needed.
So the core idea is finding the eating frequency that works for your body to create those significant fasting windows where insulin can stay low. What are the key benefits of doing IF beyond just lowering insulin?
Well, as we said, the primary benefit is dramatically lowering that excessive insulin. But IF also triggers other beneficial things. The sources note your body becomes more resourceful and conservative with nutrients when you're not constantly eating. It seems to require slightly less overall nutrient intake than with 3 meals because the system isn't constantly processing. Another really significant benefit they highlight is a dramatic increase in growth hormone.
Growth hormone, why is that important?
It's crucial because growth hormone helps to protect your muscle mass. So, unlike simple calorie restriction, which can often lead to muscle loss along with fat, combining IF helps ensure you're preferentially losing fat while preserving or maybe even gaining lean muscle.
That's a huge advantage, losing fat without getting weak or skinny fat. And you mentioned earlier that combining healthy keto and IF makes the whole thing easier to stick with long term.
Absolutely. This is really key to sustainability. Once you've gone through that adaptation phase and your body is efficient at burning fat, that's the healthy keto part, you are effectively using your own stored body fat for fuel during those fasting periods between your meals. When your body has easy access to its own abundant fuel supply, the intense hunger just goes away. And those powerful cravings for carbs and sugar also tend to disappear. The sources highlight this as the main reason this combined approach is very successful long-term, because you're no longer constantly battling those primal urges of hunger and cravings. It feels much more sustainable and, frankly, effortless once you're adapted.
That sounds incredibly freeing, especially for anyone who's felt like they're constantly fighting their body on previous diets. Okay, so we understand the problem, high insulin, the causes, those 13 triggers, and the core solution, healthy keto plus IF. How do you know if you might have this issue? What signs should you look for? The sources you shared are pretty direct about this.
They list the common symptoms associated with what they call a stubborn metabolism, which they directly link to high insulin levels. Probably the most obvious symptom is simply being unable to lose fat or weight, especially stubborn fat, despite trying conventional methods like cutting calories or increasing exercise.
And there's one specific physical sign they point to as a very quick, almost immediate indicator. A visual cue.
Yes, they are very blunt about it. They say, basically, just look down right now, and if you could see your belly, you have too much insulin. Excessive belly fat is highlighted as a primary and very common visual symptom of high insulin. It's often the last place fat goes and the first place it comes back when insulin is out of whack.
Okay, point taken.
Yeah.
What are some of the other symptoms of high insulin mentioned in the sources, besides the belly fat?
They include common metabolic syndrome markers like high blood pressure and high cholesterol, which ties back to those medication triggers we discussed earlier. Fatigue is a big one, particularly feeling tired or needing a nap after eating. That's a classic sign.
The post-meal slump.
Exactly. Decreased cognitive function issues with focus, concentration, that feeling of brain fog or poor memory is strongly associated. People with high insulin often report feeling moody, irritable, sometimes depressed, or just generally grouchy. The sources link these mood swings often to the underlying blood sugar instability. And as we touched on with adaptation, powerful, persistent cravings for carbs are listed for sure, along with feeling hungry all the time, especially between meals or shortly after eating.
It's really striking how many of those symptoms, the fatigue, the brain fog, the irritability, the cravings, are just often accepted as normal parts of aging or stress in modern life, when they could actually be rooted in something as fundamental as insulin resistance.
Exactly. They are incredibly common complaints. And the sources make a strong case that many, if not most of them, can be traced back to this underlying metabolic state driven by high insulin. And again, the contrast is key. When you shift into that fat-burning state with healthy keto and IF, and your body is calmly using its own stored fuel between meals, that relentless hunger goes away, the cravings diminish, the mood stabilizes, the energy is more consistent. This is why, as the sources note, people find this approach very successful long-term. It actually resolves those constant internal battles.
That picture of metabolic freedom is definitely appealing. Okay, so we've armed ourselves with understanding the problem, its causes, recognizing the signs. Let's get really practical. Based on the sources, how do you actually structure your eating? What foods should you focus on when following this healthy keto and intermittent fasting approach?
Okay, it starts with the eating pattern, the IF part we discussed. The practical application is to begin by consciously extending the time from when you wake up until your first meal. Go as long as you can in the morning without eating, as the source puts it. Only eat when you experience true physical hunger.
Listening to your body.
Right. The goal is to gradually push that first meal later and later. For many, the target pattern, the sweet spot, is settling into that 2-meal-a-day structure. Eating your 2 meals within a compressed eating window, ideally around 4 hours, creating that beneficial 20-hour daily fast.
So the timing is about condensing the eating period. Got it. What about the what? How do you build those 2 meals?
The sources give a simple visual guide using a plate, which sounds helpful because all that talk of macro percentages like 70% fat can get confusing. Yeah, they explicitly acknowledge that macro percentages can be confusing and maybe less practical for actually planning meals day to day. Their recommended method is much simpler and visual. Envision your plate. The structure they suggest is half of your plate should be salad or vegetables, a quarter should be protein, and the remaining quarter should be fat.
Half non-starchy veggies, a quarter protein, a quarter fat. That's a clear visual. But that quarter fat might still sound like a lot to someone who's been hearing low-fat messages for decades.
That's a very common reaction, for sure. And the sources address this by clarifying the difference between volume and caloric density. Fat is much more calorie-dense than protein or carbs. So while it might only occupy a quarter of the volume on the plate, it contributes a larger percentage of the calories. And importantly, they note that much of the fat is often already mixed with the protein, especially if you're choosing fattier cuts of meat or including things like chicken skin. So the amount of added fat isn't necessarily overwhelming. They state, it's not as much as you think in terms of sheer volume on the plate. And then there's that small amount of carbs out here, referring mainly to the fiber and minimal net carbs in all those non-starchy vegetables making up half the plate.
So the bulk is nutrient-dense plants and protein, with healthy fat added mainly for satiety and energy between meals. Speaking of the carbs out here, the sources give a specific daily limit for non-vegetable carbs, right?
Yes, the target carb limit is kept relatively low, typically between 20 and 50 total grams per day, and this is crucial. And that limit applies to non-vegetable carbohydrates, things like nuts, seeds, maybe a few berries. Vegetables themselves are considered extra and are explicitly not counted towards this daily carbohydrate limit. You're encouraged to eat plenty of them.
And how much in the way of vegetables is recommended? It sounded like quite a bit.
It is a substantial amount, yes. The sources suggest aiming for 7 to 10 cups of vegetables total per day.
Wow, 7 to 10 cups.
Yeah. They recommend focusing on leafy greens, big salads, using romaine lettuce, for instance. They do mention maybe going a bit easier on spinach initially for some people due to oxalates. They also suggest mixing raw vegetables like salad with cooked, steamed, or stir-fried vegetables, especially cruciferous types like Brussels sprouts, broccoli, asparagus.
Why the mix of raw and cooked?
Because it provides different nutrient profiles. Some nutrients are higher when raw, others become more bioavailable or easier to digest when cooked. So a practical approach might be having a large salad, maybe 5-6 cups, and then adding several cups of cooked veggies to your meals to reach that 7-10 cup goal.
7 to 10 cups is definitely a lot of greens. What if someone finds they feel worse, like bloated, or holding fluid when they try to eat that much, especially early on?
That's a great question, and the sources directly address this potential issue. If increasing greens leads to bloating, discomfort, or fluid retention that seems to hinder weight loss, they suggest this might indicate your gut microbes are not quite in the right place. Could be a sign of something like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Okay, in that situation, the advice is to initially cut back on the vegetable volume, don't force it if it makes you feel bad, and then gradually increase it over time as your gut adapts. The microbes in your gut need to process the fiber, and if you don't have the right balance yet, that fiber can ferment and cause issues. The goal is to build up tolerance so you feel good eating plenty of veggies.
That's really helpful troubleshooting advice. Okay, what about the protein sources? Quality was mentioned as being really key.
Quality is paramount in the healthy keto approach described here. Recommended protein sources include pasture-raised organic eggs. They emphasize that chicken should be out there in the grass. Wild-caught fish is preferred over farmed. And for meats, grass-fed organic meats are recommended whenever possible. They give specific examples. Eggs, 4 a day is mentioned as a possible quantity. Beef, lamb, chicken-noting chicken should include the skin. Crispy chicken wings are explicitly okay.
Crispy wings, nice. Yeah. For pork, nitrate-free organic bacon with less than 1 gram of sugar is acceptable. Fatty fish, like salmon for omega-3s, sardines for good fats, seafood in general. And organ meats get a special mention as being highly nutrient-dense, packed with vitamin A, iron, minerals, trace minerals that are often lacking.
So sourcing high-quality animal proteins is central, and they clarify the confusion around that 3-6-ounce protein recommendation earlier. You said it's the weight of the food, not the grams of protein.
Yes, they explicitly clarify this common point of confusion. The 3 to 6 ounce recommendation refers to the actual cooked or raw weight of the food product, the piece of meat, the fish fillet, the number of eggs, not the grams of protein contained within it. They provide examples to illustrate. 6 ounces of cooked chicken has about 56 grams of protein. 6 ounces of steak has around 52 grams. 6 ounces of salmon, about 44 grams, and 4 large eggs provide roughly 28 grams of protein.
Okay, so a 6-ounce portion on your plate is very different from trying to count out 6 grams of protein powder. That definitely clears things up.
Exactly. They offer a general rule of thumb. 1 ounce of the actual food product usually contains about 7 to 8 grams of protein. They suggest experimenting within that 3 to 6 ounce range per meal to see what quantity makes you feel best energy, strength, endurance. The source speaker mentioned their personal average was around 4 ounces of protein per meal.
So start around maybe 4 to 6 ounces of the actual food and adjust based on how you feel.
You avoid those sharp highs and lows.
Now back to that quarter plate of fat. What kind of healthy fats are recommended to add to meals?
The sources list several healthy fats to add, particularly important in the beginning or if you have blood sugar issues, to help you feel satisfied and comfortably make it to your next meal. Recommended fats include avocado, organic cheese, grass-fed butter, goat's cheese noted as potentially easier for some, though dairy avoidance suggested for prostate concerns, quality bacon, nitrate-free, low sugar, nut butters like almond or peanut, checking for no added sugar, nuts, seeds, olive oil, and balsamic vinaigrette. The practical advice is to add enough healthy fat to the point where I'm really satisfied so I can go longer. This is especially important for the last meal of the day to prevent nighttime hunger and snacking. They specifically mention boredom as a weakness that can lead to snacking.
So the amount of added fat isn't fixed. It's tailored to individual satiety needs to bridge the gap between meals. They also mention something called fat bombs. What are those?
Yeah, they describe a fat bomb as basically a small treat or cookie made primarily from healthy fats. Sometimes people eat them between meals. They suggest these can be useful in the beginning of the process, maybe during adaptation, to help manage hunger and cravings while your body is still learning to burn fat efficiently.
But not long-term necessarily.
Likely not needed long-term, no. They note that once you become truly fat-adapted and are efficiently burning your own stored body fat for fuel between meals, you probably won't need or want those added fat snacks because your body is providing its own steady energy supply.
What about fruits? Are any allowed on this approach? Seems pretty restrictive.
The list of acceptable fruits from the sources is indeed very limited, focusing on low-sugar options. It primarily includes limes, lemons, and berries, like strawberries, blueberries, raspberries. And berries are only acceptable as long as the quantity fits within that overall daily 20-50 gram total carbohydrate limit, remembering that the leafy green vegetables don't count toward that limit.
Okay, very limited fruit. And what about liquids? What can you drink?
Recommended liquids are pretty simple. Plain water, coffee limited, with the source suggesting maybe just 1 cup in the morning for many. Tea, unsweetened of course, and a mixture of apple cider vinegar with lemon and water is sometimes suggested. They also mention that some people initially use MCT oil or coconut oil, sometimes blended into coffee, that bulletproof style, to help extend their fasting window in the morning.
But with the caveat.
Yes, they advise caution. If you find that adding those fats to your drinks seems to slow down your weight loss, you might need to drop them. The idea is they could be providing enough dietary fave energy that your body doesn't need to tap into its own stored fat quite as readily.
It sounds like there's quite a bit of flexibility within the framework, allowing for adjustments based on how your individual body responds and adapts. What about people following a vegan diet? Are there acceptable options mentioned?
Yes, the sources specifically state that acceptable vegan proteins and fats are included within their broader list of recommended foods. The core principles remain the same. Focus on high-quality sources of fat and protein, keep non-vegetable carbs low. It just means utilizing plant-based options, specific nuts, seeds, avocados, olives, coconut, certain plant-based oils, and perhaps carefully selected fermented soy products or high-quality, low-carb vegan protein powders if they meet the criteria. Quality is still key.
That's good to know it's adaptable.
Yeah.
Are there any supplements or support strategies suggested in the sources, things to help people through the transition or just support the process generally?
Yes. They do suggest a few things that can make the switch smoother, especially during that initial adaptation phase. They strongly recommend electrolytes, often in a powder form added to water. This helps replenish minerals like sodium, potassium, and magnesium that can be lost as your body sheds excess fluid when you cut carbs and lower insulin.
The keto flu prevention.
Exactly. They also recommend B vitamins or nutritional yeast, which is rich in B vitamins, often in tablet form, specifically for managing carbohydrate cravings. They note that craving things like bread can often signal a need for B vitamins. And tying back to the earlier point about low-salt diets potentially increasing insulin resistance, they advise consciously adding more sea salt to your food, especially initially, because cutting carbs causes you to excrete more fluid and sodium, which needs replacement.
Those sound like really practical tips that can make a big difference in how someone feels during adaptation. What about exercise? Is there an optimal time to exercise on this plan?
The sources suggest that the best time to exercise is generally when you are in a fasted state, which for many people following IF would be in the morning before their first meal. They note that you tend to get better benefits from your workout when your body isn't busy digesting food and is more readily able to access stored fat for fuel.
And finally, just to reiterate, how do you know when you've truly reached that state of being fully fat adapted? When you're in, as the sources put it, hardcore ketosis, what does that actually feel like?
The ultimate indicators they point to are internal physical cues. It's less about the ketone strips at this point and more about how you feel. When you are fully fat adapted and efficiently running on ketones, the description is you crave nothing. And perhaps even more significantly, you're not even hungry anymore. That feeling of being effortlessly able to go long periods without thinking about food, without constant background hunger or nagging cravings, that is described as the definitive sign that your body's metabolic machinery has successfully made the switch.
That internal feeling of freedom from constant hunger and cravings. It sounds like a genuinely different way of experiencing daily life. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the widespread problem of excessive insulin, its many triggers: diet, lifestyle, meds, deficiencies. We've unpacked the powerful two-pronged solution: healthy ketosis focused on nutrient-dense, quality foods, combined with intermittent fasting to eat less frequently and rest the insulin system. We've explored how to recognize the signs in yourself and how to practically implement this using the plate method and specific food guidelines, We've even touched on navigating adaptation and avoiding potential pitfalls.
And the potential outcome, based on everything in these sources, is really profound. It's about shifting from a state that for many involves stubborn weight, low energy, brain fog, constant cravings, to one characterized by effortless fat burning, stable energy, mental clarity, better mood, and freedom from that perpetual hunger cycle. It's really about shifting your body back towards a metabolic state it seems well designed for.
Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over from this deep dive. Consider the possibility that our bodies, shaped over millennia, are perhaps fundamentally designed to thrive running primarily on fat and ketones, especially during inevitable periods without constant food availability. And maybe, just maybe, many of the pervasive health challenges we see today, the metabolic issues, the obesity epidemic, the energy crises are, in large part, a consequence of us constantly overriding that inherent metabolic design with a modern pattern of frequent eating dominated by easily digestible carbohydrates and processed fats. If you found this deep dive helpful and maybe even a bit eye-opening, please take just a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement really helps more people discover this kind of information and join us as we continue to explore these crucial topics that can have such a real impact on health and well-being.